They say grief comes in waves, but nobody warned me that sometimes those waves carry secrets that can drown you. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and 3 days ago I buried my husband of 15 years in what everyone called the most beautiful funeral Chicago had ever seen. The flowers were perfect, the eulogies were heartfelt, and over 400 people came to pay their respects to David Martinez, the beloved investment banker who died suddenly of a heart attack at 42. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when I walked into our Lincoln Park townhouse after the reception, exhausted and hollow, I found something waiting for me on our kitchen counter that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my life, and the man I'd loved since college. A laptop, deliberately placed and angled toward the door with a sticky note in David's handwriting that simply read, "Rebecca, watch this when you're alone. I'm sorry. D." What I discovered in that 23-minute video didn't just change how I saw my husband. It revealed a web of lies so intricate, so carefully constructed, that I realized I'd been living someone else's life for over a decade. And the most devastating part? Everyone at that beautiful funeral already knew the truth. Everyone except me. The morning David died started like any other Tuesday in our carefully orchestrated life. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. in our king-size bed with the Egyptian cotton sheets David had insisted we needed in the master bedroom of our $2.3 million townhouse that overlooked Lincoln Park. David was already gone. He'd been leaving earlier and earlier for work over the past 6 months, claiming that the investment firm was expanding into new markets and required his constant attention. I followed my usual routine: 20 minutes of yoga in our converted third-floor office space, a green smoothie made with organic kale from the Whole Foods on North Avenue, and exactly 45 minutes to transform myself from sleepy wife into Rebecca Martinez, senior account manager at Morrison & Associates marketing agency. Foundation, concealer, the perfect winged eyeliner that had taken me years to master, and my signature red lipstick, MAC's Ruby Woo, the same shade I'd worn on our first date when I was Rebecca Chen, fresh out of Northwestern with a communications degree and dreams bigger than my bank account. Our townhouse was a monument to David's success and my impeccable taste in creating the perfect backdrop for his ambitions. 3 stories of exposed brick and modern fixtures with a kitchen that had been featured in Chicago Home and Garden magazine 2 years ago. The article had called it "Urban Sophistication Meets Cozy Elegance," and I'd framed a copy for our hallway because David said it proved we'd made it. Every morning, I'd stand in that kitchen with its marble countertops and custom cabinets, drinking my coffee from handmade ceramic mugs we'd bought during our anniversary trip to Italy, and feel this quiet satisfaction that we'd built something beautiful together. The refrigerator was covered with carefully curated photos: David and me at charity galas, vacation pictures from Napa Valley and the Hamptons, dinner parties we'd hosted for his colleagues where I had spent days planning menus and selecting wines that would complement both the food and David's reputation as someone who had refined taste. I was proud of who we'd become. David had transformed from the slightly awkward finance student I'd met at a Northwestern party into one of Chicago's most promising investment bankers. And I had evolved from the eager marketing assistant who'd been thrilled to land a job at a mid-tier agency into someone who managed million-dollar campaigns for major clients. We were the couple other people looked at and wanted to be: successful, attractive, seemingly effortless in our prosperity. That Tuesday morning, as I applied my lipstick in our bathroom mirror, surrounded by the perfect lighting David had insisted on installing, I caught sight of my reflection and felt that familiar flutter of satisfaction. At 38, I looked good. The expensive skincare routine was paying off. The twice-weekly personal training sessions kept me in the same size 6 I'd worn in college, and the subtle highlights my colorist added every 8 weeks framed my face in a way that photographed beautifully for the social events that were such a crucial part of David's networking strategy. I grabbed my Hermes bag, a gift from David for our 10th anniversary, and headed to my Tesla, another symbol of our success that I had initially protested as too extravagant, but had grown to love for its silent efficiency. The drive to my office in River North took exactly 18 minutes in morning traffic, and I used that time to mentally prepare for my day: a presentation to a potential client in the hospitality industry, 3 campaign review meetings, and lunch with my assistant Sarah to discuss her professional development goals. Morrison and Associates occupied 2 floors of a glass tower with views of Lake Michigan that never failed to impress clients. I'd been there for 12 years, working my way up from junior account coordinator to senior manager. And while I loved the creative challenges and the adrenaline rush of landing major accounts, part of me had always wondered if I was settling. My college friends who'd moved to New York or Los Angeles seemed to be working on more exciting projects, with bigger budgets and more prestigious clients.
But David had been clear from early in our relationship that Chicago was where he planned to build his career. The investment firm of Caldwell, Harrison and Associates was one of the most respected in the Midwest, and David had a plan: make partner by 40, build a client base that would secure our financial future, and establish ourselves as one of the city's power couples. My job was to support that vision while building my own career in a way that complemented rather than competed with his ambitions. And it had worked. We'd become exactly the people we'd dreamed of being when we were 23 and sharing a cramped apartment in Wicker Park, eating ramen and planning our future over cheap wine. We had the house, the cars, the carefully cultivated social circle of other successful couples. We attended the right charity events, vacationed in the right places, and our Instagram feed looked like a lifestyle blog for affluent millennials who'd figured out how to adult successfully. My phone buzzed with a text from David as I settled into my office. "Big presentation today with the Peterson Group. Might be late tonight. Love you." I replied with a heart emoji and a good luck message, then turned my attention to preparing for my own presentation. This was our rhythm: 2 busy professionals supporting each other's ambitions while building something meaningful together. The Peterson Group meeting that morning went exceptionally well. I'd proposed a comprehensive rebranding campaign for their chain of boutique hotels, complete with a digital marketing strategy that would position them as the premier choice for sophisticated travelers. The client loved the creative direction, the budget projections, and most importantly, they loved working with someone who understood their vision for elevated hospitality experiences. During lunch with Sarah, my 26-year-old assistant who reminded me of myself at that age, hungry, smart, and slightly overwhelmed by the possibilities ahead of her, I found myself giving the kind of career advice I wish someone had given me. "Don't just execute other people's ideas," I told her over salads at our usual spot near the office. "Start developing your own creative voice now, while you're still junior enough that people expect you to be learning." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, taking notes on her phone. "Rebecca, can I ask you something personal? How do you balance everything? The job, the marriage, the social obligations? You make it look effortless, but I can barely manage my studio apartment and my cat." I laughed, recognizing the question I'd asked older women when I was her age. "It's not effortless, it's intentional. David and I are very deliberate about our priorities and our calendar. We plan our social events around our work schedules, we communicate constantly about our goals, and we've learned to see our individual successes as investments in our shared future." It sounded wise and mature when I said it, and it was true as far as I understood our life. David and I did communicate constantly about dinner plans, weekend events, vacation scheduling, and whose turn it was to handle various household responsibilities. We'd developed an efficient system for managing our complicated lives, and it had served us well for 15 years. After lunch, I spent the afternoon refining campaign proposals and reviewing budget allocations for existing clients. The work was engaging enough that I lost track of time until my phone buzzed with another text from David. "Peterson meeting went amazing. Celebrating with the team. Don't wait up." This was typical. When David landed a big client or closed a significant deal, his team would celebrate at one of the upscale bars near their office. I'd learned early in our marriage not to take these late nights personally. Success in David's industry required relationship building, and those relationships were often solidified over expensive whiskey and cigars. I worked until 7, then stopped at Whole Foods to pick up ingredients for the dinner party we were hosting that weekend. David's colleague Marcus and his wife Jennifer were coming over with 2 other couples from our social circle, and I'd planned a menu that would showcase both my cooking skills and our sophisticated taste. Herb-crusted lamb with roasted vegetables, a starter of burrata with truffle honey, and a chocolate tart that would pair perfectly with the vintage port David had been saving for a special occasion. By the time I got home, the townhouse felt perfectly quiet and peaceful. I poured myself a glass of the Sancerre we kept chilled for weeknight dinners and spent an hour organizing the details for Saturday's party, selecting the right playlist, choosing which serving pieces to use, and confirming that our housekeeper would come Friday to ensure everything was spotless. This was the life we'd built together: sophisticated, intentional, successful. I was proud of what we'd accomplished, proud of who we'd become as individuals and as a couple. When I finally went to bed that Tuesday night, I fell asleep feeling grateful for the stability and beauty of our carefully constructed world. David never came home that night. At 6:47 a.m. Wednesday morning, I received the phone call that would end everything I thought I knew about my life. Detective Patricia Walsh from the Chicago Police Department calling to inform me that my husband had suffered a massive heart attack in his office and been pronounced dead at Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 11:23 p.m. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of impossible logistics and surreal conversations, planning a funeral while drowning in grief, calling David's family in California, notifying his colleagues and our friends, meeting with lawyers about estate matters I'd never had to consider. Everyone kept telling me how sorry they were, how unexpected this was, how David had been so young and healthy and successful.
But it was the conversations with people from David's work that began to plant the first seeds of confusion in my devastated mind. Small inconsistencies in their stories about recent projects, references to business trips I didn't remember David mentioning, and most strangely, a sense that some of his colleagues seemed nervous around me in a way that felt like more than just awkwardness about death. I was too numb with grief to analyze these feelings deeply. I focused instead on creating the beautiful farewell that David deserved, the ceremony that would honor the man I'd loved for 15 years and the life we'd built together. And that funeral was everything I'd hoped it would be: dignified, moving, and filled with people whose lives David had touched. What I didn't know was that while I was grieving the loss of my husband, I was about to discover that the man I'd been married to for 15 years had never actually existed at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The funeral reception at the Palmer house had been everything I'd imagined when I'd spent 3 sleepless nights planning it. Elegant finger foods, a tasteful slideshow of David's life, and conversations that celebrated his memory rather than dwelling on the tragedy of losing someone so young. By 4 p.m., the last guests had offered their final condolences, and I'd hugged what felt like hundreds of people who all said some variation of, "David was such a good man," and "You two had the perfect marriage." My sister-in-law, Claire, drove me home because everyone agreed I shouldn't be alone right now. But when we pulled into the driveway of our townhouse, I suddenly couldn't bear the thought of company. The idea of making small talk or pretending to eat dinner felt impossible. "Claire, I know everyone thinks I shouldn't be alone right now, but I need some time to just sit with everything." She studied my face with the concern that had been constant since she'd flown in from San Francisco 3 days ago. "Rebecca, are you sure? I can just sit quietly, read a book, be here if you need anything." "I'm sure. I need to start figuring out how to be in this house without him, and I think I need to do that by myself first." It sounded reasonable, mature even, and Claire reluctantly agreed to check into her hotel and call me in the morning. I stood in the foyer after she left, surrounded by the silence that apparently would be my new reality. The house still smelled like the lilies from the arrangements that hadn't fit in the car to take to the cemetery. Everything looked exactly as it had when I'd left that morning, but somehow the space felt completely foreign, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. That's when I noticed the laptop. Our silver MacBook Pro was sitting open on the kitchen island, positioned deliberately so that anyone walking through the front door would see it immediately. This was strange because David was obsessive about keeping our workspace organized, and he never left electronics out in common areas. The screen was black, but there was a yellow sticky note attached to the top edge. My hands shook as I read David's familiar handwriting. Rebecca, watch this when you're alone. I'm sorry. D. The casual way he'd signed it with just his initial, the same way he'd left me notes about picking up dry cleaning or meeting for dinner, made the whole thing feel surreal. I stared at that piece of paper for what felt like 10 minutes, my brain struggling to process what it might mean. When had he written this? Why was it here now? I pressed the spacebar, and the screen illuminated to show a video file titled, For Rebecca, Final Version. The timestamp showed it had been created just 5 days ago, 2 days before David died. The file was 23 minutes and 14 seconds long. My finger hovered over the play button. Some instinct I couldn't name was screaming at me not to watch it, to close the laptop and pretend I'd never seen it. 3 days of grief had left me feeling fragile enough that I wasn't sure I could handle whatever David had felt compelled to record in what would turn out to be his final days. But I clicked play anyway. David's face filled the screen, and the immediate shock of seeing him alive and moving again nearly knocked the breath out of me. He was sitting in his office at Caldwell Harrison and Associates, but something about his appearance was off. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his tie was loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes that I didn't remember seeing in person. He began, and his voice had a quality I'd never heard before, raw, exhausted, almost pleading. Rebecca, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and I'm so sorry you have to find out this way. I'm sorry for all of it, but I couldn't figure out how to tell you while I was alive. I was too much of a coward. He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that was achingly familiar. I need to tell you some things about our marriage, about my work, about who I really am. And I need you to know that everything I'm about to say doesn't change the fact that I loved you. I loved you more than I've ever loved anything in my life, which is why I could never bring myself to destroy your world while I was still in it. My chest tightened. David, what are you talking about? I whispered to the screen as if he could hear me.
The first thing you need to know is that I haven't been working at Caldwell, Harrison and Associates for the past 8 months. I was fired in March for embezzling client funds. Not just a little bit, Rebecca. $2.8 million over the course of 2 years. The words hit me like physical blows. I actually looked around the kitchen as if someone else might be there to confirm what I was hearing. That's not possible, I said out loud. You were just there yesterday. You've been going to work every day. On screen, David continued as if he'd anticipated my reaction. I know you're probably thinking this is impossible because I've been leaving for work every morning, coming home with stories about clients and deals and office politics. For the past 8 months, I've been going to a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue and spending my days applying for jobs that I'll never get because word travels fast in this industry. When you steal from clients, especially the kind of clients Caldwell represents, you don't get second chances. I paused the video, my mind reeling. 8 months? For 8 months, David had been leaving our house every morning and pretending to go to a job he didn't have? How was that possible? How had I not noticed? But as I thought back, I started to remember things differently. The texts saying he'd be late because of client dinners that I'd never heard details about afterward, the way he'd seemed distracted and tired more often than usual. The fact that his usual stress about work deadlines and difficult clients had seemed to disappear around the same time I'd assumed he was just getting better at managing job pressure. I clicked play again, dreading what other revelations were coming. The money I stole wasn't for gambling or drugs or anything like that. It was for us, Rebecca, for this house, for your car, for the vacations and the dinners and the life we were living. My salary was good, but it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle I wanted to give you. So I started taking little amounts from accounts that I thought wouldn't be noticed immediately, and then it became bigger amounts to cover the first amounts, and then
He trailed off, shaking his head. You remember when we bought this house 3 years ago? You were worried about the mortgage payments, and I told you I'd gotten a promotion and a raise that would make it affordable. That wasn't true. I was already stealing money by then. The promotion was real, but the raise wasn't nearly enough to cover a $15,000 monthly mortgage payment on top of everything else. I felt like I was falling, even though I was sitting down. Our house, our beautiful house that I had been so proud of, that had been featured in a magazine, that represented everything we'd worked for, it had been purchased with stolen money. The Tesla you're driving? Stolen money. The anniversary trip to Italy? Stolen money. The engagement ring I gave you when I proposed wasn't bought with money I'd saved from my bonus. It was bought with money I'd taken from the Henderson Family Trust. I looked down at my left hand, at the platinum band with the emerald cut diamond that I'd worn for 15 years. The ring that represented David's love and commitment that I'd shown off to friends, that I'd stared at during difficult moments in our marriage as a reminder of the promises we'd made to each other. It had been purchased with money stolen from a family that had trusted David with their financial future. I know what you're thinking, David said, and his voice was getting shakier. You're wondering how you didn't know, how you didn't see the signs. The truth is, I got very good at lying. I created fake pay stubs. I opened credit cards you didn't know about to float expenses when I was between withdrawals. I even had a friend at the office who would cover for me if you ever called looking for me. The friend at the office. I thought about the strange conversations I'd had with David's colleagues at the funeral, the way that some of them had seemed nervous or had given me vague answers when I had mentioned how much David had loved his work. They'd all known he'd been fired, and they'd been trying to figure out how much I knew. But Rebecca, the stealing wasn't the worst thing I did. David's image paused, and I could see him struggling with whatever he was about to say next. The worst thing was letting you believe in a marriage that was built on lies, letting you plan your life around someone who wasn't real. I wanted to stop the video. I wanted to throw the laptop across the room and pretend this conversation was never happening, but I couldn't look away from David's face, from the pain and guilt and desperation in his expression. There's something else, someone else. Her name is Amanda Clark. She worked at Caldwell in the accounting department. We started seeing each other about a year ago. The affair revelation should have destroyed me, but after everything else I'd learned in the past 10 minutes, it felt almost secondary. Of course there was another woman. Of course the man who could steal millions of dollars and lie about his job for 8 months was also capable of cheating on his wife. It wasn't supposed to happen, David continued, and I could see tears in his eyes now.
I realized I was crying, but they were strange tears. Not the grief I'd been feeling for the past 3 days, but something angrier and more bitter. How many of the people at David's funeral had known about Amanda? How many times had I stood next to colleagues and friends who knew my husband was cheating on me while I played the role of the devoted widow? She was at the funeral today, wasn't she? I said to the screen, thinking about all the faces I didn't recognize, all the people who'd offered condolences without explaining how they knew David. As if reading my mind, David said, I don't know if Amanda will come to my funeral. I told her 3 weeks ago that I couldn't leave you, that I was going to confess everything and try to make it right somehow. She didn't take it well. She said, if I tried to reconcile with you, she'd tell you everything herself, in the most painful way possible. The video continued for another 10 minutes, with David explaining the details of his financial crimes, the investigation that had been closing in on him, and his certainty that he was going to prison. He talked about how the stress had been affecting his health, how he'd been having chest pains and panic attacks for months. I know this sounds like I'm making excuses, but I want you to understand that everything I did was because I loved you so much that I couldn't bear the thought of you being disappointed in me. I couldn't stand the idea of you having to live a smaller life because your husband wasn't successful enough to give you everything you deserved.
By the time the video ended, I was sitting in my kitchen surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my life. The man I'd mourned for 3 days, the marriage I'd celebrated for 15 years, the financial security I'd counted on for my future. All of it had been built on lies, so elaborate and systematic that I felt like I'd been living in someone else's life without knowing it. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of our house that wasn't really ours, wearing a ring that had been bought with stolen money, mourning a marriage that had been a performance. And for the first time since I'd gotten the call about David's death, I felt something other than grief. I felt rage. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at our dining room table with David's laptop, a legal pad, and every financial document I could find in our home office, trying to piece together the architecture of 15 years of lies. The rage that had bloomed in my chest after watching the confession video had crystallized into something colder and more focused, a need to understand exactly how deep this deception went. By 3 a.m., I had filled 6 pages with notes and questions. If David had been fired 8 months ago, where had the money been coming from to pay our mortgage, our credit card bills, our car payments? The confession video had mentioned stolen funds, but it had also mentioned that he'd stopped working. The numbers didn't add up, which meant there were still pieces of this puzzle I hadn't found. I opened our laptop and navigated to our online banking. David had always handled our finances. He was the numbers person, after all, and I'd be grateful to let him manage the complexity of mortgages and investments and retirement planning. Now, that trust felt like willful blindness. What I found in our accounts made my stomach lurch. Our checking account, which I'd assumed contained the steady deposits from David's salary, showed a pattern of irregular transfers that made no sense. Large deposits of $15,000 or $20,000 would appear randomly, followed by immediate withdrawals to cover our monthly expenses. But the source of these deposits was listed only as External Transfer Account 4421. I had never seen account 4421 on any of our statements. I clicked through every linked account I could find, our savings, our retirement accounts, the money market account we used for vacation savings. None of them were numbered 4421. David had been moving money from an account that wasn't visible to me, an account I had never known existed. The more I dug, the more complex the financial picture became. Credit cards I'd never seen statements for, a second mortgage on our house that I'd never signed papers for, investment accounts with balances that fluctuated wildly and seemed to have no connection to the steady, conservative portfolio David had always told me we were building. By 5:30 a.m., I called the one person I knew who might be able to help me make sense of this financial maze, my college roommate Jessica, who had become a forensic accountant for a firm that specialized in white-collar crime investigations. Rebecca? Jessica's voice was thick with sleep and concern. Honey, what's wrong? It's not even 6 a.m. Jess, I need your help with something, and I need you to promise me you'll keep this confidential until I figure out what I'm dealing with. I heard her moving around, probably getting out of bed and finding somewhere private to talk. Of course, what's going on? I told her everything. The confession video, the embezzlement, the fake job, the affair. With each revelation, Jessica's responses shifted from shock to professional curiosity to something that sounded almost like excitement. Rebecca, this sounds like one of the most sophisticated financial fraud cases I've ever heard of. The level of documentation and cover-up required to pull this off for years? Your husband must have been incredibly methodical. Can you help me figure out where the money was really coming from? David said he was fired 8 months ago, but our bills have been getting paid. There has to be another source.
Send me screenshots of everything you can access. Bank statements, credit card accounts, investment portfolios, even utility bills and mortgage statements. I'll come over this weekend and we'll reverse engineer the whole system. After I hung up with Jessica, I realized I needed to start making a list of everyone who might have known about David's double life. The confession video had mentioned Amanda Clark from the accounting department, and I was certain that at least some of David's colleagues had known about his termination. But I was beginning to suspect the deception went much deeper than just his workplace. I thought about our friends, the couples we socialized with regularly. Marcus and Jennifer, who David claimed were his closest colleagues at Caldwell. They'd been at the funeral, had given beautiful speeches about David's integrity and work ethic. Had they known they were lying while they spoke? And what about our financial planner, Richard Steinberg,
who met with us twice a year to review our portfolio and discuss our retirement goals. David always handled those meetings, claiming that since I wasn't as comfortable with investment terminology, it made more sense for him to be the primary contact. Now I wondered if Richard had been part of the cover-up, or if David had been lying to him too. At 7 a.m., I called Caldwell Harrison and Associates and asked to speak with Amanda Clark. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said, "but Amanda Clark no longer works here. She left the company several months ago. Do you have a forwarding address or contact information? This is regarding David Martinez's estate." There was a long pause. "Ma'am, I need to transfer you to our legal department for any inquiries related to Mr. Martinez. Can you hold, please?" The fact that mentioning David's name had immediately triggered a transfer to the legal department told me everything I needed to know about how his termination had been handled. This wasn't a quiet resignation or a mutual parting of ways. This had been a firing that involved lawyers and probably criminal investigations. When the legal department picked up, I found myself talking to someone named Patricia Wong, who spoke with the careful precision of someone who had been expecting this call. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm very sorry for your loss. I understand you're calling about Amanda Clark. I need to speak with her about some financial matters related to my husband's estate. I am afraid I can't provide Amanda's contact information, but I can tell you that she's no longer with the firm and that any communication regarding Mr. Martinez's employment here should go through your attorney. Miss Wong, was my husband under investigation when he died?" Another long pause. "Mrs. Martinez, I really think you should speak with a lawyer before we continue this conversation." After I hung up, I sat in our kitchen staring at the coffee maker David had programmed to start automatically every morning at 6 a.m. Even that small detail felt like part of the performance now. The devoted husband who made sure his wife woke up to fresh coffee when really he'd been covering up crimes that could have sent him to prison. I decided my next call should be to our family lawyer, Robert Chen, who had handled our wills and estate planning. If David had been under criminal investigation, Robert needed to know before we started any probate proceedings. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry about David," Robert said when his secretary put me through. "I was planning to call you early next week to discuss the estate proceedings. Robert, I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know David was fired from Caldwell for embezzlement?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Rebecca, where did you hear that?" "David left me a confession video. He stole almost $3 million from client accounts. Were you aware of this?" Rebecca, I think you should come to my office today. There are some things we need to discuss in person." That afternoon, sitting in Robert's downtown office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, I learned that the legal ramifications of David's death were far more complicated than I had imagined. 3 weeks ago, David came to see me, Robert explained, his hands folded carefully on his desk. He told me he was under federal investigation for embezzlement and that he wanted to make sure you were protected if charges were filed. We spent several hours going through your finances to document which assets were purchased with legitimate income versus other sources. You've known for 3 weeks that my husband was a criminal and you didn't tell me? David was my client, and he asked me to maintain attorney-client privilege. He said he was planning to tell you himself and that he wanted to make sure all the legal protections were in place first. Robert opened a thick file folder. "Rebecca, David transferred ownership of several assets to you during our meeting. The house is now solely in your name, as is your car, and about $400,000 in what we determined were legitimately earned savings. He also set up a trust that should protect those assets from federal seizure." I stared at the documents he slid across the desk. He was planning for this. For his death. I think David was planning for prison, but yes, he was very concerned about making sure you were not left with nothing when the investigation concluded. "What about Amanda Clark? Do you know how to find her?" Robert's expression shifted. "Rebecca, I need to ask you why you want to contact Amanda. Because she was having an affair with my husband, and she was involved in covering up his crimes, I want to know what else she knows about our finances.
Amanda Clark contacted our office 2 days after David's funeral. She's claiming that David promised her money, and she's threatening to sue the estate. She also mentioned that she has documentation that could be embarrassing for you. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. Amanda wasn't just David's mistress. She was someone who felt entitled to a piece of whatever David had left behind, and she had information that she thought gave her leverage over me. What kind of documentation? I don't know specifically, but she mentioned photos and financial records. Rebecca, I think Amanda Clark is going to be a problem. As I drove home that evening, my mind was spinning with the complexity of what I was facing. David's crimes weren't just going to destroy my understanding of our marriage, they were going to create legal and financial consequences that could last for years. And somewhere in Chicago was a woman who had been sleeping with my husband, who knew details about his crimes that I was still discovering, and who thought she deserved a piece of whatever life I had left. But the strangest thing was that instead of feeling overwhelmed or helpless, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose. For 15 years, I'd been the supporting character in David's story, the dutiful wife who managed the household and attended the social events and never asked too many questions about the details of our financial success. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I was the protagonist of my own story, and I was going to find out exactly how deep this deception went, no matter who tried to stop me. The first step was finding Amanda Clark, and I had a feeling that when I did, I was going to discover that David's confession video had only told me half the truth. Finding Amanda Clark turned out to be easier than I had expected. After 2 days of dead ends, disconnected phone numbers from Caldwell's employee directory, and a forwarding address that led to a UPS store, I decided to try a different approach. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Williams, a former Chicago police detective who specialized in financial crimes and missing persons. Most people think they can disappear in a city like Chicago, but everyone leaves digital footprints. Social media, credit cards, employment records. Your Amanda Clark has been busy since she left Caldwell, but she hasn't been invisible. Marcus slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of social media posts, employment records, and what looked like surveillance photos taken from a distance. Amanda Clark, 28 years old, originally from Springfield, Illinois. She's been working at a small accounting firm in Naperville since she left Caldwell, lives in a studio apartment on the north side, drives a 2019 BMW that she definitely couldn't afford on an entry-level accountant salary. I studied the photos. Amanda was younger than I'd expected, with long blonde hair and the kind of effortless style that comes from having both money and confidence. In one photo, she was leaving what looked like an upscale restaurant, wearing designer clothes and carrying a handbag I recognized as Chanel. Marcus, how is she affording this lifestyle? You said she's working at a small firm. That's where it gets interesting, he pointed to a printout of bank records. Amanda's been making regular deposits that don't match her reported income. We're talking about an extra $3,000 to $4,000 a month, always in cash, always on the same day of the month. The pattern looked familiar. The 15th? How did you know that? I thought about David's confession video, about the timeline of his embezzlement, and about the regular transfers I'd found in our banking records. David was transferring money to her. Even after he was fired, he was still giving her money. From where? If he wasn't working, where was he getting thousands of dollars to give to his girlfriend? That was the question that had been keeping me awake for the past week. David's confession had explained the embezzlement and the fake job, but it hadn't explained how he continued to fund both our lifestyle and Amanda's for 8 months after losing his legitimate income. I think, I said slowly, there's more money missing than David admitted to. And I think
Amanda knows where it came from. Marcus nodded. My thoughts exactly. And here's something else interesting. He showed me another document. Amanda filed a police report 3 days after your husband's funeral. She claims someone broke into our apartment and stole documents and a laptop computer. But the weird thing is, nothing else was taken. Not jewelry, not electronics, not cash she had sitting on her dresser. Just papers and the computer. Someone else is looking for information about David's crimes. Or Amanda staged the break-in to destroy evidence. Either way, she's scared of something. I stared at Amanda's photo, this young woman who had been sleeping with my husband while helping him steal millions of dollars. I need to talk to her. Rebecca, I don't think that's a good idea. Amanda has already threatened legal action against your estate. If you approach her directly, she could claim harassment or intimidation. Then what do you suggest? Marcus closed the folder. Let me make the initial contact. I'll tell her I'm working for your attorney to resolve the estate issues. If she agrees to meet, I'll set it up somewhere public and safe. 2 days later, I was sitting in the back corner of a Starbucks in Evanston, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, watching Marcus talk to a woman who looked even younger in person than she had in surveillance photos. Amanda Clark had agreed to meet about David's estate, but she'd insisted on choosing the location and had arrived 30 minutes early, clearly checking to make sure she wasn't being set up.
From my table 20 feet away, I could see her expressions as Marcus explained that I wanted to understand the full scope of David's financial situation. At first, she looked defensive, her arms crossed and her jaw tight. But as the conversation continued, her posture changed. She started leaning forward, talking more animatedly, and at one point she pulled out her phone and showed Marcus something on the screen. After 15 minutes, Marcus stood up and walked to the counter to order another coffee. That was my signal. I approached Amanda's table and sat down across from her before she had a chance to leave. Mrs. Martinez. Amanda's voice was cooler than I'd expected, but not hostile. Up close, I could see that she was beautiful in the way David had always been attracted to. Polished, put together, but with an edge that suggested she was tougher than she looked. Amanda, thank you for agreeing to meet. I didn't agree to meet with you. I agreed to meet with your investigator. I know, but I need to hear the truth about David, and I don't think you're going to tell him everything you told my husband. Amanda studied my face for a long moment. What exactly do you want to know? I want to know where David was getting the money to pay you after he was fired. I want to know what documents were stolen from your apartment, and I want to know what you meant when you told my lawyer that you have information that could be embarrassing for me. She laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. David really didn't tell you anything, did he? Even in his confession video, he made himself sound like some tragic figure who stole money to buy his wife a nice life. What didn't he tell me? Amanda pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like text messages. David didn't just steal money from client accounts at Caldwell. He'd been running a side business for 3 years, helping other financial advisors hide money from their clients' audits. He was basically laundering money for 6 investment firms across the Midwest. The words hit me like a physical blow. The embezzlement David had confessed to was bad enough, but money laundering was federal crime territory. That's not possible. David worked for one firm. He didn't have connections to other companies. Your husband was a lot more connected than you think. Amanda showed me her phone screen, which displayed a spreadsheet with names, dates, and dollar amounts. This is just 1 month's worth of transactions. David was moving money between accounts for firms in Milwaukee, St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Detroit. He was taking a 10% cut of everything he claimed. I stared at the numbers, trying to process the magnitude of what she was showing me. The monthly totals were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. How do you know all this? Because I was his bookkeeper. David needed someone inside an accounting department to help him create false documentation and cover the paper trails. That's how we met, and that's how we started spending time together. The affair hadn't been some spontaneous emotional connection. It had been a business partnership that had become personal. You were partners in crime. We were partners in everything.
David promised me that when he had enough money saved, we'd leave Chicago and start over somewhere else. He said he was going to divorce you and we'd move to Costa Rica or somewhere without extradition treaties. Each revelation felt like discovering that David had been a completely different person than the man I'd married. How long was this going on? The money laundering? 3 years. The affair? About 18 months. Amanda's voice softened slightly. Look, Mrs. Martinez, I know you hate me, and I know this is probably destroying your image of your marriage, but David talked about you constantly. He felt guilty about what he was doing, but he also felt trapped by it. He said the only reason he'd started stealing in the first place was because he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you. So this is my fault? No, it's David's fault, but it's also more complicated than just a husband who wanted to buy his wife nice things. Amanda leaned forward. Did David ever tell you about his gambling? The question came out of nowhere. David didn't gamble. He thought casinos were a waste of money. David had been betting on sports through offshore sites for 5 years. Basketball, football, baseball, sometimes hockey. He wasn't just stealing money to fund your lifestyle. He was stealing money to cover gambling debts that kept getting bigger. I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole with no bottom. Every answer led to more questions, each revelation more devastating than the last. How much did he owe? When he died, probably close to $2 million. That's why he couldn't just stop the money laundering operation even after he was fired from Caldwell. He owed money to people who don't accept excuses. Amanda pulled out another document, this one printed on regular paper. These are screenshots of David's betting accounts and the messages he was getting from his bookies. Some of these messages were threatening him, Mrs. Martinez. They were threatening both of us. I read the messages with growing horror. Demands for payment, descriptions of what would happen if David didn't come up with the money, references to finding him and anyone he cared about if he tried to disappear. The most recent message was dated just 4 days before David died. Amanda, do you think David's heart attack was really natural? She was quiet for a long moment. I think David was under more stress than any human being could handle. I think he was terrified of going to prison, terrified of the people he owed money to, and terrified of you finding out who he really was. Whether that stress killed him or whether someone helped it along, I honestly don't know.
What was stolen from your apartment? Backup hard drives with financial records, printed transaction reports, and correspondence between David and the other firms he was working with. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were looking for. Do you think it was the federal investigators? No, if it was the FBI, they would have come with a warrant and taken everything. This was someone who wanted specific information and didn't want anyone to know they'd been there. As Amanda talked, I realized that David's death hadn't ended his criminal enterprise. There were other people involved, other firms that had been using David's services, other criminals who might want to make sure their involvement never came to light. Amanda, I need to ask you something directly. Are you in danger? She nodded. We both are. David's dead, but his business partners are still alive, and they're going to want to make sure that no one who knew about their operation can testify against them. I left that meeting with a new understanding of exactly how much my life had changed. I wasn't just a widow dealing with financial crimes and marital betrayal. I was potentially a target of people who had killed to protect their secrets I didn't even fully understand. For the first time since I'd watched David's confession video, I was scared. But I was also determined. If there were people out there who thought they could intimidate me into silence, they were about to learn that Rebecca Martinez was no longer the naive wife who looked the other way while her husband built a criminal empire. They were about to meet the woman who had nothing left to lose. The first sign that Amanda had been right about the danger came 2 days after our meeting at Starbucks. I was leaving Morrison & Associates after a particularly draining day of pretending to focus on work, while my mind raced through everything I'd learned about David's criminal network. As I walked toward my Tesla in the underground parking garage, I noticed a black sedan that had been behind me during my drive to work that morning. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid.
Chicago has thousands of black sedans, and just because I'd seen the same car twice didn't mean I was being followed. But when I made 3 unnecessary turns on my way home and the sedan stayed exactly 2 cars behind me, my hands started shaking on the steering wheel. I pulled into a McDonald's parking lot and watched in my rearview mirror as the sedan drove past without stopping. The windows were tinted too dark for me to see the driver, but I caught a partial license plate, Illinois tag starting with FR7. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, texting the plate information to Marcus Williams, before I felt safe enough to drive home. Marcus called me back within an hour. Rebecca, that car is registered to a company called Midwest Financial Consulting. You ever heard of them? I was standing in my kitchen, still wearing my work clothes, staring out the window at our quiet residential street. No, should I have? According to Amanda's documents, Midwest Financial was one of David's biggest clients for the money laundering operation. They were moving about $50,000 a month through his system. The reality of what this meant hit me like ice water. They know I met with Amanda. It's possible. Or they might just be keeping tabs on David's widow to see what you know. Either way, you need to be careful. These aren't white-collar criminals who solve problems with lawyers. These are people who use violence when they feel threatened. That evening, I did something I'd never imagined myself doing. I researched the home security systems and personal protection services. Within 48 hours, I had a state-of-the-art alarm system installed in our townhouse and hired a private security consultant named Kelly Rodriguez, a former Army military police officer who specialized in protecting clients involved in financial crime cases. Your husband created a significant problem for a lot of people. When someone dies suddenly in the middle of a criminal investigation, their associates get nervous about what information might surface. You represent an unknown variable. But I don't know anything that could hurt them. Until 2 weeks ago, I didn't even know David was involved in any of this. Kelly paused at my front window, adjusting the blinds to eliminate the clear view into my living room. They don't know what you know, and in their world, it's safer to eliminate potential threats than to try to figure out who's actually dangerous. The conversation was surreal. I was standing in the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals for David, talking to a woman with a concealed carry permit about whether criminals might try to kill me to protect secrets I didn't even fully understand. But Kelly's presence was also oddly comforting. She was about my age, with short dark hair and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how to handle dangerous situations. For the first time since David's death, I felt like someone was completely on my side. Kelly, how long do you think I'll need protection? It depends on what you decide to do with the information you have. If you stay quiet, cooperate with federal investigators when they contact you, and don't try to dig any deeper into David's business relationships, the danger will probably fade over time. These people will move on to other concerns. And if I don't stay quiet? Kelly met my eyes. Then we need to prepare for the possibility that they'll escalate their approach. 3 days later, I found out what escalation looked like.
I was working late at Morrison & Associates, catching up on client campaigns that I'd been neglecting while dealing with David's secrets, when my office phone rang at 8:30 p.m. The building was mostly empty except for security and a few other workaholics like myself. Rebecca Martinez? The voice was male, with a slight accent I couldn't identify. Yes, who is this? A friend of your late husband. David owed some people money, and we need to discuss how that debt is going to be resolved. My throat went dry. I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about David's debts. You'll need to speak with our estate attorney. Mrs. Martinez, your husband borrowed $2.3 million from my associates. When someone dies with that kind of outstanding obligation, the debt doesn't just disappear. It transfers to the surviving spouse. I was recording the call on my phone, a precaution Kelly had insisted on for any unknown callers. That's not how estate law works. I'm not responsible for debts I didn't co-sign for. The man laughed, but it wasn't pleasant. I'm not talking about estate law, Mrs. Martinez. I'm talking about honor among business people.
David received valuable services from my associates. Those services need to be compensated. What kind of services? Protection, information, access to certain opportunities. The kind of services that allow a man to move millions of dollars without attracting unwanted attention from federal investigators. I realized he was talking about more than just gambling debts. David's money laundering operation had been protected by people who expected to be paid for that protection. I don't have $2 million, but you have assets. A house with $2.3 million? Investment accounts? Your husband was very careful to transfer certain properties into your name before his unfortunate death. He knew about the asset transfers Robert Chen had helped David execute. These people had been watching our legal and financial moves more closely than I'd realized. You have 48 hours to contact me at this number with a proposal for resolving the situation. If you choose not to cooperate, we'll need to pursue alternative collection methods. The call ended, leaving me alone in my office with the terrifying understanding that David's gambling debts hadn't died with him. Someone expected me to pay $2 million for services I'd never requested to protect a criminal operation I'd never known existed. I called Kelly immediately. "Pack a bag," she said without hesitation. "You're not going home tonight. These people just graduated from surveillance to direct threats." "Kelly, I can't just disappear. I have a job, responsibilities." "Kelly, you also have your life. And right now, that's what we need to focus on protecting." I spent the night in a hotel room in Schaumburg, lying awake, staring at the ceiling while Kelly researched the phone number the caller had used. By morning, she had traced it to a burner phone purchased with cash at an electronics store in Milwaukee, but the security cameras at the store had been conveniently malfunctioning that day. "Professional," Kelly noted. "These aren't amateur criminals trying to collect a gambling debt. This is organized crime with resources and experience." "What are my options?" Kelly sat across from me at the hotel room's small table, her laptop open to what looked like law enforcement databases. "Option 1, pay them. Liquidate your assets and hope that satisfies their claim." "I don't want to pay criminals for services to a husband who lied to me for years." "Option 2, go to the FBI. Tell them about the threats and cooperate fully with their investigation of David's money laundering network." "Would that protect me?" "Eventually, maybe, but witness protection isn't guaranteed, and federal cases can take years to prosecute. During that time, you'd be a target." "What's option 3? Kelly closed her laptop and looked directly at me. "Option 3 is what I call the nuclear option. We gather evidence about everyone in David's network and make it clear that if anything happens to you, that information goes to law enforcement, the media, and anyone else who might be interested." "Mutually assured destruction." "Exactly. You become more dangerous to them alive than dead." The idea was terrifying and appealing at the same time. For 2 weeks, I'd been reacting to discoveries about David's lies and crimes. I'd been the victim, the betrayed wife, the woman who didn't know her own life had been built on criminal enterprises. But option 3 meant taking control of the narrative and forcing other people to react to my choices. What would we need to do? First, we'd need to work with Amanda to compile comprehensive documentation of David's operation. Names, dates, financial records, communication between David and his criminal partners. Amanda's already been threatened. She might not want to cooperate. Amanda's in the same position as you are. She's a loose end that these people would prefer to tie up permanently. If we approach this right, she'll realize that her best chance of survival is working with us. Kelly pulled out a secure phone. "I'm going to contact some people I know in federal law enforcement. We need to understand exactly what kind of investigation is already underway and how we can position you as a valuable cooperating witness rather than a potential victim." As Kelly made her calls, I stared out the hotel window at the suburban landscape of strip malls and chain restaurants. 2 weeks ago, I was Rebecca Martinez, the successful marketing executive with the perfect marriage and the beautiful house. Now I was Rebecca Martinez, the widow, hiding in a hotel room while criminals demanded millions of dollars and federal agents planned to use me as bait in their investigation. But for the first time since I'd watched David's confession video, I felt like I had a plan. I was done being the victim of other people's choices. It was time to start making some of my own choices.
And the first choice was to make sure that everyone who had profited from David's crimes understood that his widow was not going to be their next victim. The second meeting with Amanda Clark took place in the most unlikely location imaginable, the children's section of the Schaumburg Public Library, at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. Kelly had chosen the spot because it was public enough to discourage violence, but contained enough background noise from story time to mask our conversation from any electronic surveillance. Amanda looked different than she had at Starbucks. Gone were the designer clothes and confident posture. She wore jeans, a Northwestern University sweatshirt, and sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me approaching her table between the picture books and wooden puzzles, her first words were, "They contacted you too, didn't they?" I sat down across from her, acutely aware of Kelly positioned at a nearby table with a clear view of all the exits. $2.3 million for services David received. You? $1.8 million. Apparently, I'm worth less than the grieving widow. Amanda's attempt at dark humor fell flat. Rebecca, I'm scared. These people, they're not like the white-collar criminals I used to help David fool. These are the kind of people who make problems disappear permanently. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but what I saw was genuine fear mixed with the same desperate determination I'd been feeling for the past week. My security consultant thinks our best chance is to work together, pool our information, and make ourselves too dangerous to kill. What does that mean exactly? I pulled out a legal pad with notes Kelly and I had prepared the night before. It means we document everything. Every transaction David processed, every criminal he worked with, every piece of evidence that could send these people to federal prison. Then we make it clear that if anything happens to either of us, that information goes to the FBI, the Chicago Tribune, and every law enforcement agency in the Midwest. Amanda was quiet for a long moment, watching a librarian read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to a group of preschoolers. You realize this means trusting each other, and I slept with your husband for 18 months while helping him steal millions of dollars. I'm not asking you to be my friend, Amanda. I'm asking you to be my partner in staying alive. She pulled a small notebook from her purse. I've been keeping records since the day David was fired. Names, dates, amounts, communication logs. I knew eventually someone would try to blame me for everything that went wrong, so I documented every transaction and every conversation. How much do you have? Enough to prosecute 15 different investment firms across 6 states. Enough to send about 40 people to federal prison. Enough to probably get us both killed if these people knew what I had. I felt a chill despite the warm library atmosphere. Where is it? Safe deposit box in a bank in Milwaukee. He didn't know about it. I opened the account under my maiden name 6 months after we started working together. This was more than I'd hoped for. Amanda, that information could be our insurance policy. Or our death warrant. The moment we start making demands or threats, these people will stop playing games and start treating us like enemies instead of loose ends. Kelly appeared at our table, her arrival so sudden and quiet that Amanda jumped. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem. There's a man in the parking lot who's been photographing cars for the past 20 minutes. He's particularly interested in your Honda, Amanda. Amanda grew pale. They followed me. Not necessarily. Could be they're tracking your car electronically. Either way, you're not safe going home tonight. I can't just disappear. I have a job, an apartment. You have a life, Kelly said firmly, and right now, that's more important than your lease agreement. For the next 2 hours, the 3 of us sat in that library, planning what Kelly called Operation Lighthouse, making ourselves visible and valuable enough that harming us would create more problems than protecting us. The strategy was complex but elegant. We would contact the FBI with an offer to cooperate in their investigation of David's money laundering network, but we would also prepare a comprehensive information package that would be automatically released to media outlets and law enforcement agencies if anything happened to either Amanda or me. Dead man's switch, Kelly explained. You both stay alive, the information stays contained.
Something happens to either of you, and 40 criminals wake up to find their names and crimes on the front page of every newspaper in the Midwest. Amanda was taking notes frantically. How do we set something like that up? I have contacts who specialize in this kind of arrangement. Former military, current private security, people who understand that sometimes the best defense is a very public offense. As we planned our strategy, I found myself studying Amanda more closely. She was younger than me, but she'd survived in David's criminal world for 3 years. She understood the financial mechanisms of money laundering better than I understood my own retirement accounts. And most importantly, she'd been keeping detailed records when she could have easily destroyed evidence and disappeared. Amanda, can I ask you something personal? She looked up from her notebook. I think we're past the point of avoiding personal questions. Why did you keep all those records? You could have destroyed everything and walked away clean. She was quiet for a moment, watching Kelly scan the library for potential threats. Because I knew David was in over his head, and I knew eventually everything would collapse. I wanted to make sure that when it did, I had enough information to protect myself from the people who would want to blame me for the whole operation.
And now? Now I realize that protecting myself means protecting you, too. We're both widows in this situation, Rebecca. David's dead, but his choices are still controlling our lives. The only way either of us gets free is if we take control of the narrative. That evening, Amanda and I checked into adjoining rooms at a hotel in Oak Brook, 20 minutes from the library and far enough from our normal routines to make surveillance difficult. Kelly had swept both rooms for electronic devices and established secure communication protocols for our conversations. Around 8 p.m., Amanda knocked on the connecting door between our rooms. Rebecca, there's something else I need to tell you about David. Something that wasn't in his confession video. I opened the door to find her holding a manila envelope. More financial records? Personal records. Letters, emails, photos. Things David gave me that I probably should have destroyed but couldn't bring myself to throw away. She handed me the envelope, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. What kind of personal records? Evidence that David was planning to leave you even before he met me. Evidence that some of the stories he told you about your marriage weren't exactly true. I sat down on my hotel bed, the envelope feeling heavier than it should have. Amanda, I've learned that my husband was a criminal, a gambling addict, and a cheater. What else could possibly matter at this point? The house you're so proud of, the one that was featured in the magazine, David bought it with money he stole from his first embezzlement victim, a 70-year-old woman named Eleanor Hartman, who trusted him with her retirement savings. The words hit me like a physical blow. Our beautiful house, the symbol of everything we had achieved together, had been purchased with money stolen from an elderly woman. There's more. The engagement ring David gave you? He told me he bought it with money he'd been saving for years to surprise you. But I found the receipt, Rebecca. He bought that ring 2 weeks after he started stealing from Eleanor Hartman's account. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of financial documents, email printouts, and photos. The first document was a receipt from Cartier for an engagement ring purchased in the amount of $47,000, dated 3 years before David had proposed to me. The second document was a withdrawal slip from Eleanor Hartman's retirement account for $50,000, dated 1 day before the Cartier receipt. He was planning our engagement while he was stealing from this woman? Rebecca, David had been embezzling money for almost your entire relationship. The romantic proposal story, the surprise ring, the way he claimed he'd been saving money for years to buy you something special, all of it was planned around a crime he'd already committed. I looked at the photos next, pictures of David and me that I'd never seen before, taken with the telephoto lens from a distance. Pictures of our house, our cars, our life together. But mixed in with those familiar images were photos of David with other women. Not just Amanda, but 3 or 4 different women over what looked like several years. Amanda, how many affairs did David have? I don't know the exact number, but I know I wasn't the first, and I probably wouldn't have been the last if he'd lived longer. The final document in the envelope was a draft letter addressed to me, written in David's handwriting but never sent. It was dated 6 months before his death. Rebecca, the letter began, I've been trying to find the courage to tell you this for years, but I don't think I'll ever be brave enough to say it to your face. Our marriage has been a performance for so long that I'm not sure either of us remembers what was real about it. I've been stealing money to fund the life you wanted, sleeping with other women because I felt disconnected from you, and planning an escape that would leave you with nothing. I stopped reading and looked at Amanda. He was going to leave me with nothing? That letter was written before he transferred the assets to protect you. I think meeting me changed his plans. He realized he could have a relationship with someone who knew about his crimes, someone who didn't expect him to be the perfect husband. So saving my assets was guilt? Not love? I think it was both. David loved you, Rebecca, but he also resented you for being the reason he felt like he had to commit crimes to maintain your lifestyle. I finished reading the letter, which detailed David's plans to disappear to Costa Rica with approximately $4 million in stolen funds, leaving me to face the legal consequences of his crimes alone. The man I'd grieved for, the marriage I'd celebrated for 15 years, had been an elaborate deception designed to fund an escape plan that would have destroyed my life. Why are you showing me this, Amanda? Because I want you to understand that we're not just fighting for our lives against these criminals. We're fighting for the right to define our own futures instead of being victims of David's choices forever. She sat down across from me, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. David made both of us accessories to his crimes. He made both of us targets of dangerous people. But he also left us with something valuable. Information that could destroy everyone who helped him steal and launder money. You want revenge. I want justice. And I want to make sure that David's death doesn't become just the first tragedy in a series of tragedies that destroy everyone who loved him.
That night, lying in my hotel bed and staring at the ceiling, I realized that everything I'd believed about my life had been wrong. But instead of feeling devastated, I felt something closer to relief. For 15 years, I'd been trying to live up to an image of perfection that had been funded by crime and built on lies. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the opportunity to choose who I wanted to be, based on the truth rather than the fantasy. And I was choosing to be someone who fought back. The FBI field office in downtown Chicago was nothing like what I'd imagined from watching crime dramas. Instead of dramatic interrogation rooms and urgent tactical operations, Special Agent Sarah Chen's office looked like any other corporate workspace. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and the persistent hum of air conditioning that couldn't quite mask the smell of burnt coffee. But Agent Chen herself was exactly what I'd hoped for. Sharp, professional, and most importantly, someone who understood that Amanda and I were offering information that could make or break the federal investigation into David's money laundering network. Mrs. Martinez, Miss Clark, Agent Chen began, settling behind her desk with a thick file folder. I want to be very clear about what we're discussing here. You're both potential targets of a criminal organization, but you're also both potentially valuable witnesses in a federal investigation that's been ongoing for 8 months. Amanda and I exchanged glances. 8 months meant the investigation had started around the time David was fired from Caldwell, Harrison, and Associates. Agent Chen, I said, we need to know if cooperating with you will actually protect us, or if it will just paint bigger targets on our backs. That depends on the quality of information you can provide, and how we structure your cooperation. She opened the file folder, revealing photographs of men I didn't recognize. We know David was processing money for criminal organizations across 6 states. What we don't know is the specific mechanism he used to clean the funds, or the identities of his primary contacts. Amanda pulled out her notebook. I can give you transaction logs for 37 different clients, including dates, amounts, and the routing numbers for both source and destination accounts.
Agent Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. Miss Clark, that's more comprehensive information than we've been able to gather in 8 months of investigation. I was David's bookkeeper for 3 years. I documented everything because I knew eventually someone would try to blame me for the whole operation. And Mrs. Martinez, what can you contribute? I had been dreading this question because the honest answer was that I couldn't contribute specific information about David's crimes. But Kelly had helped me understand that I had something potentially more valuable: leverage. Agent Chen, I can contribute motivation. These people have demanded that I pay $2.3 million for services David received, and they've made it clear that they're willing to use violence if I don't comply. I'm not going to pay criminals for protecting a criminal operation I never knew existed. What exactly are you proposing? Kelly spoke for the first time since we'd entered the office. We're proposing a controlled confrontation. Mrs. Martinez and Miss Clark make contact with the people who've been threatening them, but in a situation where federal agents can document the extortion attempts and potentially gather intelligence about the larger criminal network. Agent Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs in her file. That's extremely dangerous. These aren't white-collar criminals who solve problems through negotiation. These are people who use violence when they feel threatened. Agent Chen, they're already threatening violence. At least this way, we're choosing the time and place for the confrontation instead of waiting for them to choose it for us. What did you have in mind? Amanda leaned forward. The people who contacted us want money. We propose a meeting to discuss payment terms, but instead of bringing money, we bring evidence of their criminal activities and a very clear message about what happens if they continue to threaten us. You want to blackmail organized crime figures with evidence of money laundering? We want to make it clear that killing us would create more problems than leaving us alone, Kelly corrected. These people are pragmatists. If harming Mrs. Martinez and Miss Clark means their financial crimes become front-page news in 6 states, they'll find other solutions to their problems. Agent Chen closed the file folder and looked directly at me. Mrs. Martinez, what you're proposing could work, but it could also get you killed. Are you absolutely certain you want to take this risk? I thought about David's confession video, about Amanda's documentation of his affairs and escape plans, about the house I'd been so proud of that had been purchased with money stolen from an elderly woman's retirement account. For 15 years, I'd lived a life built on someone else's choices and someone else's crimes. This was my chance to make choices of my own. Agent Chen, I'm certain. But I want to make sure that if something goes wrong, there's enough evidence on record to prosecute everyone involved in David's network. Fair enough. Let's talk about how we structure this meeting. Over the next 3 hours, we planned what Agent Chen called Operation Clarity, a controlled confrontation designed to gather evidence while protecting Amanda and I from immediate retaliation. The plan was complex but elegant. I would contact the man who had called me about David's debts and agree to meet to discuss payment arrangements. But instead of meeting alone, I would be surrounded by federal agents with recording equipment, and Amanda would be positioned nearby with a laptop containing all of her documentation about David's criminal network.
The goal, Agent Chen explained, is to get them talking about their specific relationships with David, the services they provided to his money laundering operation, and, most importantly, their current demands for payment. If we can establish that they're attempting to extort money from you based on criminal activities, we have grounds for immediate arrests. And if they realize it's a setup, that's where Miss Clark's documentation becomes crucial. The moment they understand they're being recorded, she makes it clear that comprehensive evidence of their crimes will be released to media outlets if anything happens to either of you. Kelly had chosen the location for the meeting. A restaurant in downtown Chicago with multiple exits, excellent sightlines for surveillance, and enough ambient noise to mask the fact that federal agents would be positioned at nearby tables. The key, she explained, is making them feel comfortable enough to talk while ensuring that you're never actually in danger. 2 days later, I sat in the back corner of Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, wearing a wire and trying to look like a nervous widow who was prepared to negotiate with criminals. Amanda was 3 tables away, her laptop open and her phone ready to contact journalists if our plan went sideways.
Agent Chen and 5 other federal agents were scattered throughout the restaurant, disguised as business diners and couples on dates. At exactly 7 p.m., 2 men approached my table. The first was the voice from my phone call, middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of intimidating people. The second was younger, broader, and had the look of someone whose job involved physical persuasion. "Mrs. Martinez," the older man said, sliding into the booth across from me, "I'm Michael Torino, and this is my associate, Vincent." I had practiced this conversation with Agent Chen dozens of times, but sitting across from actual criminals was more terrifying than I had expected. "Mr. Torino, I want to understand exactly what services you provided to my husband and why you think I'm responsible for paying for them. Your husband was moving a lot of money through accounts that could have attracted unwanted attention from federal investigators. My associates provided protection for those transactions and insurance that David's activities wouldn't be discovered." "What kind of protection?" "Information about federal investigations, advance warning when accounts were being monitored, assistance with creating documentation that would satisfy auditing requirements." Torino's voice was casual, as if he were discussing restaurant recommendations. "David was processing about $2 million a month for various clients. Without our protection, he would have been arrested within 6 months. I could see Agent Chen at a nearby table, her hand positioned near her concealed weapon. "And now you want me to pay $2.3 million for services I never requested? Mrs. Martinez, when someone dies with outstanding obligations to our organization, those obligations transfer to their estate. David received valuable services for 3 years. Those services need to be compensated." Vincent leaned forward slightly, and I could see what looked like a gun outline under his jacket. "Mrs. Martinez, we're not unreasonable people. We understand that liquidating assets takes time. We're prepared to accept payment in installments." "And if I refuse to pay?" Torino's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "That would be unfortunate. Accidents happen to people who don't honor their obligations." That was the statement Agent Chen had been waiting for. The explicit threat recorded on federal surveillance equipment in front of multiple witnesses. I saw her signal to the other agents positioned around the restaurant. "Mr. Torino, I think you should know that every word of this conversation is being recorded by the FBI and that comprehensive documentation of your money laundering operation is currently sitting on a laptop 30 feet from this table." Torino went completely still. Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket, but stopped when he saw federal agents standing up from tables around the restaurant. "Mrs. Martinez, that was a very poor decision." "No, Mr. Torino, the poor decision was threatening the widow of a federal informant. I was bluffing about David being an informant, but Torino didn't know that." His face went pale as Agent Chen approached our table with her badge visible and her weapon drawn. "Michael Torino, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering and attempted extortion." As Agent Chen read Torino his rights, Amanda appeared at my table with her laptop. "Mr. Torino, you should also know that if anything happens to Mrs. Martinez or to me, documentation of your financial crimes will be automatically released to the Chicago Tribune, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and law enforcement agencies in 6 states. Vincent tried to run, but was tackled by 2 federal agents before he reached the restaurant's front door. Within minutes, both men were in handcuffs and being led out of Gibson's, while other diners stared in amazement. "Mrs. Martinez," Agent Chen said, helping me remove the recording equipment, "that was either very brave or very stupid. I'm not sure which. Both, probably, but it worked. It worked for tonight, but you realize this isn't over. Torino and Vincent are small players in a larger organization. Their arrests might eliminate the immediate threat, but it could also escalate the situation." Amanda closed her laptop and joined us. "Agent Chen, how many people can we arrest with the information I have?" "Based on what you've shown me so far, probably 40 to 50 people across 6 states. It's going to be one of the largest financial crime prosecutions in Midwest history.
I looked around the restaurant, which was slowly returning to normal as federal agents cleared the scene. 3 weeks ago, I was a grieving widow who thought her biggest problem was planning a funeral. Now I was a federal witness who had just helped arrest organized crime figures while threatening to expose a multi-state money laundering operation.
Agent Chen, what happens next? Next, we execute search warrants on about 20 different businesses and arrest everyone we can identify from Miss Clark's documentation. And next, you and Amanda disappear into witness protection until we can round up everyone who might want to retaliate. As we left the restaurant that night, surrounded by federal agents and headed for a safe house location I wouldn't learn until we arrived, I realized that I'd finally taken complete control of my life. For the first time since David's death, I wasn't reacting to other people's choices or trying to understand other people's lies. I was making decisions that would determine my own future, and that felt more liberating than anything I'd experienced in 15 years of marriage. 6 months after the arrests at Gibson's Steakhouse, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment in Seattle, watching the sunrise over Elliott Bay while my coffee brewed. The view from the 23rd floor was spectacular. Mountains, water, and a city that didn't know anything about Rebecca Martinez or David's crimes or the woman I used to be when I thought my life was perfect. The federal prosecution had unfolded exactly as Agent Chen had predicted. 47 people arrested across 6 states, money laundering operations worth over $50 million dismantled. Front page coverage in newspapers from Chicago to Milwaukee to Detroit with headlines that read, "Multi-state financial crime ring exposed by widow's courage," and "How one woman's investigation brought down organized crime network." But the media attention, while gratifying, hadn't been the most important outcome. The most important outcome was sitting on my kitchen counter. A letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office informing me that the federal government had recovered $3.2 million in assets directly traceable to David's crimes, and that as a cooperating witness who had helped secure multiple convictions, I was entitled to keep the legitimately purchased assets that had been transferred to me before David's death. More importantly, the letter confirmed that Eleanor Hartman, the 70-year-old woman whose retirement savings had been used to buy my engagement ring, would receive full restitution plus interest. I'd insisted on that condition before agreeing to testify, and seeing it in writing had finally allowed me to sleep without nightmares about being complicit in an elderly woman's financial devastation. Amanda had also landed on her feet, though her path had been different from mine. After testifying in the federal trials, she'd accepted a position with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, using her expertise in money laundering operations to help investigate other cases. We talked occasionally, a friendship born from shared trauma and survival, but maintained across the distance of very different new lives. "You know," she'd said during our last phone call, "I think David actually did us a favor by dying when he did." That's a terrible thing to say. Is it? If he'd lived, we would have spent years in federal prison as accessories to his crimes. His death forced us to become protagonists in our own stories instead of supporting characters in his criminal enterprise. She wasn't wrong. David's death had been the catalyst for the most honest 18 months of my adult life. 18 months of learning who I was when I wasn't trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect homemaker, the perfect partner in someone else's vision of success. The woman I'd discovered was someone I actually liked. Someone who was smart enough to work with federal investigators, brave enough to confront organized crime figures, and strong enough to rebuild her life from scratch at 38. Someone who had turned the worst betrayal imaginable into an opportunity for complete reinvention. My new job was perfect in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was managing marketing campaigns for luxury hotels and overpriced restaurants. I was now the director of victim services for a nonprofit organization that helped people whose lives had been destroyed by white-collar crime. My days were spent working with families who had lost their savings to investment fraud,
elderly people who had been scammed by financial advisors, and small business owners whose trusted accountants had embezzled their operating funds. The work was heartbreaking and healing at the same time. Every day, I met with people who were experiencing the same sense of betrayal and disorientation I'd felt when I'd watched David's confession video. But now I could offer them something I hadn't had. Guidance from someone who had survived the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her life. The hardest part, I often told new clients, isn't the financial loss or even the betrayal. It's learning that you can trust your own judgment again after discovering that you missed so many signs for so long. My apartment was a deliberate contrast to the Lincoln Park townhouse I'd shared with David. Instead of expensive furniture and carefully curated decorative objects, I'd chosen pieces that were beautiful but comfortable, meaningful but not pretentious. The walls were covered with photos from the travel I'd done over the past 6 months. Hiking in the Pacific Northwest, visiting national parks, exploring cities where no one knew my history. The engagement ring that started this entire journey was now sitting in a safety deposit box along with other jewelry David had given me during our marriage. I couldn't wear pieces that had been purchased with stolen money, but I also couldn't bring myself to destroy them. They were evidence of a relationship that was both real and fake, loving and manipulative, meaningful and completely constructed. Instead, I wore a simple silver band on my right hand that I'd bought for myself during a weekend trip to Portland. It represented the commitment I'd made to honoring my own choices instead of adapting to someone else's vision of what my life should look like.
The legal proceedings had finally concluded the previous month with the sentencing of Michael Torino and Vincent Calabresi, the men who had threatened to kill me over David's gambling debts. Torino received 15 years in federal prison for money laundering and extortion. Vincent received 8 years as an accessory. Both men had provided information about their criminal associates in exchange for reduced sentences, leading to additional arrests that Agent Chen said would continue for another year. Justice, Agent Chen had told me after the final sentencing hearing, doesn't always look like what we expect. But in this case, I think we achieved something close to it. I agreed, but not for the reasons she probably meant. Justice, for me, hadn't been about sending criminals to prison, though I was glad they could no longer threaten other people. Justice had been about reclaiming agency over my own life after 15 years of unknowingly living someone else's carefully constructed fantasy. The most unexpected development had come 3 months ago, when I'd received a letter from Eleanor Hartman, the woman whose retirement savings David had stolen to buy my engagement ring. She'd written to thank me for ensuring that she received full restitution, but also to tell me something that had changed how I understood David's crimes. "Mrs. Martinez," her letter had read, "I want you to know that your husband visited me 2 weeks before he died. He came to my home in Evanston and confessed what he had done with my money. He gave me a cashier's check for the full amount he had stolen, plus interest, and he cried when he apologized for betraying my trust. I know this doesn't excuse his crimes, but I thought you should know that he was trying to make things right before he died." The letter had forced me to reconsider David's final weeks in a new light. The confession video, the asset transfers to protect me, the visit to Eleanor Hartman. David had been systematically trying to repair the damage he'd caused, even though he'd known it would probably mean prison time and the destruction of everything we'd built together. That realization had been both comforting and tragic. Comforting because it meant that not everything about our relationship had been a performance. Tragic because it meant David had chosen to destroy himself and nearly destroy me, rather than asking for help when his lies had begun to spiral out of control. This morning, 6 months after leaving Chicago, I was preparing for a meeting that would have been unimaginable during my marriage to David.
I was interviewing to become a consultant for the FBI's Victim Services Program, helping other people navigate the psychological and practical challenges of cooperating with federal investigations. You have a unique perspective, Agent Chen had told me during our preliminary conversation. You understand both the trauma of discovering that your life was built on lies and the empowerment that comes from choosing to fight back rather than remain a victim.
The position would require travel, testifying in court cases, and working with people whose lives had been shattered by crimes they hadn't known were happening around them. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire life, helping people rebuild when everything they'd believed had been destroyed. As I got dressed for the interview, I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror and was surprised by what I saw. The woman looking back at me was recognizable as Rebecca Martinez, but she was also completely different. Stronger, more confident, more comfortable in her own skin. She looked like someone who had survived something terrible and emerged not just intact, but improved. My phone buzzed with a text from Kelly Rodriguez, who had become more than just my security consultant over the past year. She'd become one of my closest friends. Someone who understood that rebuilding your life required both courage and strategy. Good luck with the FBI interview today. You're going to be amazing. Also, dinner tomorrow night? There's a new restaurant in Belltown I want to try. I smiled as I typed back my acceptance. The relationships I'd built over the past year were based on choice rather than convenience, honesty rather than performance, mutual respect rather than unexamined obligation. They were the kind of relationships I thought I'd had during my marriage, but now I understood the difference between connections that were real and connections that were carefully constructed to serve someone else's purposes. The ferry ride to downtown Seattle was peaceful, giving me time to review my notes for the interview and think about how I wanted to present my qualifications. But mostly, I just watched the water and the mountains and felt grateful for the specific sequence of terrible events that had led me to this specific moment. David's death had been tragic. His crimes had been devastating. The months of threats and federal investigations had been terrifying. But they had also been the catalyst for the most authentic version of myself I'd ever been. I was no longer the woman who made herself smaller to avoid conflict, who accepted other people's versions of reality without question, who measured her worth by her ability to support someone else's ambitions. I was Rebecca Martinez, federal witness, crime victim advocate, and survivor who had turned the worst betrayal imaginable into the foundation for a life that was finally, completely, authentically mine. The ferry docked, and I walked toward my new future with the confidence of someone who had learned that she could survive anything, and the wisdom of someone who had chosen to transform survival into purpose. Behind me, the past dissolved into the wake of the ferry. Ahead of me, the city sparkled with possibilities I was finally brave enough to pursue. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.